The first thing that came back was the pain in his hands. Then the light, red and swimming, and somewhere above him on the hill the sound of men screaming. Sergeant First Class Bob Howard was lying in the dirt in the northeast corner of Cambodia on the morning of December 30th, 1968, and for a few long seconds he did not know whether he was blind. His clothes had been torn off him by the blast. His rifle was gone, thrown out of his hands and into the brush by the force of it. 5 men who had been near him a moment before were dead. When his vision finally cleared enough to make out shapes, the first shape he saw was an enemy soldier coming toward him through the smoke, carrying a flamethrower. The soldier stopped. He looked down at the wreckage of the man in front of him, at the blood and the shredded hands and the eyes that could barely focus, and he made a decision. He decided Howard was already finished. He turned and walked away to find someone worth burning. By every law of probability that governed that jungle, the next several hours should have ended with Bob Howard dead on that hillside alongside everyone else. They did not. And the strange thing, the thing this story is really about, is that the enemy who hunted men like him never even learned his name. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. There's a particular kind of legend that grows up around a war, and it usually wants a clean shape. The lone hero, the single moment, the enemy who wrote in his journal, the night the great American appeared, that he had looked upon something more than a man. It is a satisfying shape, and you will find versions of it attached to a lot of famous soldiers. The trouble is that the men Bob Howard fought never knew who he was. They could not have written his name in a diary, because they were never told it. He went into their country wearing a uniform stripped of every insignia, carrying weapons that were not American, under orders that said if he was captured or killed, his own government would stand in front of the cameras and swear he had never existed. So the honest version of this story does not begin with what the enemy wrote about Bob Howard. It begins with what they wrote about the men like him, the ones they could never quite catch, and what that paper trail tells us about the most dangerous job almost no one in America was allowed to know was happening. By 1968, the war everyone could see was the loudest conflict on the planet. More than 500,000 American troops were in South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive that January had hit the country like a thrown punch and shattered the comfortable idea that the end was near. Reporters filed from rice paddies and city streets. Generals gave briefings. The whole world was watching. Underneath all of that ran a different war, and this one had no briefings and no reporters and almost no paper that anyone was meant to read. It was run by an organization with a name built specifically to make your eyes slide off it. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The men inside called it SOG. The name sounded like a committee that reviewed reports. What SOG actually did was send small teams of men across the borders into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, into places where American forces were not officially present and where the ordinary rules of war did not apply. The teams were tiny. A few Americans, usually Green Berets, alongside a larger group of indigenous fighters, most often Montagnard tribesmen from the Central Highlands who could read the jungle in ways that took an American operator years to even approach. They went in by helicopter, fast and low, and the moment the aircraft lifted away, they were alone, sometimes 40 kilometers deep in enemy ground, with only the ammunition each man could carry and a radio. The men called this going across the fence. If a team was found, the job of the North Vietnamese forces guarding that ground was simple and total. Find them and destroy them. And the enemy did write about these teams, not in diaries about individual heroes, but in something far more revealing, the cold institutional language of an army trying to solve a problem it could not solve. Captured North Vietnamese documents describe entire counter-reconnaissance companies positioned in valleys like the A Shao for the single purpose of hunting SOG recon teams and the helicopters that carried them. Other accounts from inside that security network describe rewards offered to any soldier who could kill or capture one of the Americans, what one Green Beret later described as amounting to a bounty, a medal for killing a recon man. In its own internal reckoning for 1969, SOG recorded that it was inflicting roughly 150 enemy dead for every Green Beret it lost. That figures SOG's own count, made in the heat of a secret war, and it should be read as the claim of one side rather than a settled number. But even discounted, it points at something the enemy clearly understood. A handful of men were forcing an army of tens of thousands to spend a force many times their size just trying to find them. This is the world Bob Howard lived in, and to understand what he did in it, you have to understand where he came from. He was born Robert Lewis Howard on July 11th, 1939, in Opelika, Alabama, into a family that already had a relationship with the airborne. His father and 4 uncles had all served with airborne units in the Second World War. Some of them did not come home, and some came home and then died of their wounds. The family had little money. As a boy, Howard picked cotton to help put food on the table. At 17, he dropped out of school and enlisted in the Army in Montgomery in the summer of 1956, following the men and his family into uniform. He found his way into Special Forces, where his specialty was demolitions, and then into SOG, where he would spend the majority of his time in Vietnam across 5 separate tours. The numbers attached to his combat record are the kind that get rounded off in the retelling, so it is worth slowing down on them. He served, by the count, in his official Special Warfare Center biography, 58 months of combat, though other sources put it nearer 54. Over that time, he was wounded 14 times. He was awarded 8 Purple Hearts, and when people asked him later why only 8 when he had been hit 14 times, he said plainly that the other wounds had not been bad enough to keep him out of the field. Among the SOG veterans, men who were not in the habit of being impressed by anyone, Howard was spoken of in lowered voices. The author and SOG veteran John Plaster, who served alongside him, would later write that Howard remained the most highly decorated American soldier, and while you cannot rank courage on a chart, the awards themselves tell the outline of the story. 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, a Silver Star, the 8 Purple Hearts, and eventually the Medal of Honor. That last one has a history that says as much about the war as it does about the man. Between 1967 and 1968, across roughly 13 months, Bob Howard was nominated for the Medal of Honor 3 separate times, for 3 separate actions. The first 2 nominations were not approved. They were downgraded to lesser awards because the actions had taken place in Laos and Cambodia in the war the United States was officially not fighting. To award the nation's highest decoration for those actions, the Army would have had to describe where they happened, and it could not say where they happened. So the paperwork was quietly reduced, and the full recognition was held back, not because the courage was in doubt, but because the geography was a state secret. Look at what those first 2 actions actually were, and the downgrade started to feel almost absurd. On November 16, 1967, leading a SOG mission in southeastern Laos, Howard's team was pinned by heavy machine gun fire. He moved out on his own, eliminated the sniper holding the team in place, then charged the machine gun position and killed the men working it. When a second gun opened up, he crawled forward and threw a grenade to silence it. And when the enemy got the gun firing again, he knocked it out a second time with an anti-tank weapon. The team was extracted. That was a recommendation for the Medal of Honor, downgraded. A year later, in mid-November of 1968, he went into Laos again with a hatchet platoon out of Forward Operating Base 2. After 4 days on the ground, the force was ambushed, and this time the enemy brought armor, a Soviet-built PT-76 tank. Howard crept forward through the fire and knocked the tank out with an anti-tank rocket. When a medical evacuation helicopter was shot down, Howard, already wounded, charged something like 300 yards through enemy fire to bring the 2 pilots and a wounded door gunner back to safety. Hit again, this time by 14 pieces of shrapnel. He went at the enemy once more, killed 2 soldiers, and dragged a 3rd back as a prisoner. Later, he silenced the 37mm anti-aircraft gun that had been tearing into the helicopters, which finally allowed the extraction to happen. That was the second recommendation. It was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross. So by late December 1968, Bob Howard was a man the enemy had been trying very hard to kill for over a year and had not managed to. What happened next is the action that finally could not be reduced, because in the end the Army decided this one would be recorded as having taken place in the Republic of Vietnam, even though the men who were there knew the ground was Cambodian. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It started with a man left behind. On December 29, 1968, a 10-man SOG reconnaissance patrol was operating in the tangle of high ground where Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam pressed together at their corners, the place the men call the tri-border. The patrol split into two elements, and both came under attack. In the rear element was Private First Class Robert Francis Sheridan, leading a small group of Montagnards. Sheridan was badly wounded, unable to stand, and when enemy fire forced the patrol to pull back, he was left on the ground. There was no choice that did not cost something, and the cost of that one was a man. Through the following hours, an Air Force Forward Air Control aircraft circling the area, call sign Covey, picked up an emergency radio signal coming from where Sheridan had last been seen. Nobody knew whether Sheridan himself was sending it, or whether the enemy had taken his radio and was using it to bait a trap. SOG had a name for the missions sent to recover men lost behind the lines. They were called Bright Light Missions, and they were among the most dangerous things the organization did, because they sent men back into ground the enemy already controlled toward a signal that might be a friend and might be a hook. The next morning, a platoon of around 40 men was sent out to follow that signal. First Lieutenant James R. Jerson commanded it. Sergeant First Class Bob Howard was his platoon sergeant, second in command. Most of the platoon were Montagnard fighters. They came under fire before they were even on the ground, and one of the helicopters carrying them was shot down. They fought their way clear of the landing zone and pushed inland, fighting through more contact, working toward the hill where the signal was coming from. Howard told Jerson he thought they were walking into an ambush. He also made it clear he had no intention of leaving a man behind, so they kept climbing. As the platoon moved up the slope, the hillside came apart. By most accounts, the device was a command-detonated mine, a Chinese claymore, set and weighted on, and it went off in the middle of them. Howard was knocked unconscious. The blast tore the clothing from his body, threw his rifle away, and shredded his hands with shrapnel. 5 men near him were killed outright. When he came to, blind and in tremendous pain, the platoon was scattered and under fire from an enemy force the citation would later estimate at 2 companies, and the flamethrower soldier was making his slow way through the smoke before deciding Howard was not worth the fuel. What Howard did over the next 3.5 hours is set down in the language of the Medal of Honor citation, and even that careful official prose cannot quite flatten it. His vision came back enough to see Lieutenant Jerson lying seriously wounded a few feet away, exposed, calling out. Howard could not walk. He had no weapon, so he began to crawl through the fire to reach him. As he started working on Jerson, trying to get the wounded man's gear off him, an enemy bullet struck one of the ammunition pouches on Jerson's belt and set off several magazines at once, a fresh blast right where Howard was working. He took cover for a moment, and then he went back. He got one of Jerson's legs up under his own arm and began dragging the officer down the hill toward the rest of the platoon, and somewhere in that movement he was shot in the foot. He had no rifle through any of this. He found a fellow Green Beret further down the slope, a sergeant who, by Howard's own account years later, was unhurt but crying and not using his weapon, frozen the way men sometimes freeze. The man would not hand over his rifle, but he gave Howard a .45 caliber pistol. With that pistol and a grenade, Howard fought. He remembered shooting an enemy soldier who was running at him with a bayonet, a man who fell across the wounded Lieutenant Howard was dragging. The enemy, he understood, were trying to take them alive. He got Jerson back to the platoon, and then he did the thing that turned a massacre into a defense. Crawling, unable to stand, he moved from man to man across the perimeter, giving first aid, directing fire, pushing a broken and frightened group of soldiers back into something that could hold. He called in air support so close that he later described the rounds landing between his own feet, ricochets striking him in the face, the only way to keep the enemy off a position that was nearly overrun. For 3.5 hours, that small force and the aircraft overhead beat back attack after attack, until at last there was enough control over the ground to bring helicopters in. It was a night extraction done under the light of flares, and the sudden arrival of the Hueys caught the enemy off guard. The first aircraft carried out the wounded and the dead. One was so overloaded that crews had to make terrible choices about what the airframe could lift. Through it all, Howard ran the loading, and as badly hurt as he was, he made himself the last man onto the last helicopter. As it climbed away, he remembered, with the particular grief of a man who measures these things, that they had not brought back Sheridan. And he passed out. He woke in a field hospital, bandaged and miserable, and learned the rest of it there. Lieutenant James Jerson, the man he had crawled through fire to save and dragged down a hill with one leg tucked under his arm, had died of his wounds. Robert Sheridan, the man the whole mission had been mounted to recover, was never found. A follow-up team made up entirely of Montagnards was reinserted into the battle site in January of 1969 to search for him, stayed on the ground 4 days, and was then killed in a helicopter crash shortly after their own emergency extraction, taking whatever they had learned with them. Sheridan remains listed as missing in action. His remains never recovered. The Recon Company commander, Captain Ed Lesesson, wrote up the nomination for Howard's actions on that hill. This time there was no downgrade. On March 2nd, 1971, President Richard Nixon presented Robert Howard the Medal of Honor at the White House, more than 2 years after the action it described. The citation locates the fight carefully in the Republic of Vietnam. The men who bled on that slope knew it was Cambodia. The discrepancy is not a mistake. It is the secret war written into the official record in the only language the government would allow. Howard did not slow down. He received a direct commission as a lieutenant in 1969, having entered the Army as an enlisted man and an Alabama dropout. By accounts from men who served with him, after this last action left him in a hospital bed, he checked himself out before he was supposed to and went back to his unit because that was where he believed he could do the most good. He stayed in the Army for 36 years and retired a full colonel in 1992. He went to work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. He served as the national president of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society in his final years, and he made trips to Iraq to visit soldiers who were younger than his memories. He died of pancreatic cancer on December 23, 2009, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in February of 2010. Now, come back to the hook this story started with the idea of what the enemy wrote in their journals the night Bob Howard appeared. The honest answer is that no such journal is known to exist, and the reason it does not exist is the whole point. The men hunting SOG could not record Howard's name because the entire architecture of that war was built to make sure they never had it. He was sterile. He was deniable. To the North Vietnamese soldiers in the tri-border, he was not Bob Howard of Opelika, Alabama. He was one more of the green-faced men who came out of helicopters where no Americans were supposed to be and were impossibly hard to kill. But the enemy did leave a record, and it is more telling than any diary would have been. They left the directives ordering whole companies into valleys to hunt teams a fraction of their size. They left the rewards offered for a single dead or captured recon man. They left the counter-reconnaissance units, the trail watchers, the reinforced security that pulled tens of thousands of soldiers off the war to deal with a few hundred. That is the document the enemy actually wrote about men like Bob Howard, written in the dry vocabulary of an army reorganizing itself around a threat it could not name and could not stop. It is not a ghost story. It is a logistics problem, and it is a far higher tribute than any legend. There is a cost buried in this that the awards do not show, and it deserves to be said plainly. The mission that earned the Medal of Honor was a failure at the thing it set out to do. It did not bring Sheridan home. Jerson died. The follow-up team died. The Montagnards who made up most of these platoons, who fought for their own land and their own families and were extraordinary at it, were largely left behind when the war ended, and many of them paid for that service in ways no American medal ever acknowledged. Howard himself carried that arithmetic for the rest of his life. The men who had given everything on a hillside to recover one soldier they never recovered. He did not describe those men as failures. He said they had done their best. He was right. So remember the names, because the war spent so long refusing to record them. Robert Lewis Howard, who crawled blind and unarmed through 2 companies of enemy fire and would not leave his lieutenant. First Lieutenant James R. Jerson, who commanded that doomed rescue and died of his wounds. Private First Class Robert Francis Sheridan, the man they went back for, still out there somewhere in that high border country. Captain Ed Lesesson, who made sure that this time the record would not be quietly reduced. And the Montagnard fighters, whose names mostly went unwritten, who went up that hill anyway. The enemy never learned what to call them. We can. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Sources consulted. U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, SWCS. Distinguished member of the Special Forces Regiment Biography of Colonel Robert Howard, SWCS.mil. Official Army biography covering his origins, the 3 Medal of Honor nominations, and the November 1967, November 1968, and December 30th, 1968 actions. Medal of Honor citation for First Lieutenant Robert L. Howard, then Sergeant First Class, United States Army, as reproduced in primary form. Source for the wording, placing the action in the Republic of Vietnam and the 3.5-hour defense. Arlington National Cemetery Memorial Record for Robert L. Howard, arlingtoncemetery.net. Source for the December 30th, 1968 mission details, Lieutenant Jim Jerson, the landmine, the ammunition pouch detonation, and the foot wound. HistoryNet, Army holder of the top 3 awards for valor in combat, Robert Lewis Howard. Source for the .45 pistol, the drag down the hill, and Jerson's death. Task Force Omega Incorporated, case file for Robert Francis Sheridan, taskforceomega.org. Source for the December 29th, 30 sequence, the composition of the Bright Light team, Jerson's death, and the fate of the January 1969 follow-up team and Sheridan's MIA status. John L. Plaster, SOG, The Secret Wars of America's Commandos in Vietnam. Reference for Howard's reputation among SOG veterans and the recollection of the downgraded Distinguished Service Cross Action PT-76 tank anti-aircraft gun downed Huey crew. Stephen Moore, Uncommon Valor, the recon company that earned 5 medals of honor and included the most decorated Green Beret and associated material. Referenced for SOG structure, across the fence operations, the documented enemy bounties on recon men, and the SOG recorded kill ratio, presented as SOG's own wartime figure, not an independently verified number. D Magazine and SOFREP Steve Balestrieri, interview-based accounts. Source for Howard's first-person description of regaining consciousness. The flamethrower soldier, and the airstrikes called onto his own position.